Rule 0, the rule of cool, and the rules where they can all interact and where it can go either really right or really bad. But the rules are there to guide us and kind of show us the way.
I'm Nerdarchy Ted.
I'm Nerdarchy Dave. Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds.
All right, so with this video, did we really want, to just use this as a means to tell people to read the damn books?
Maybe. It depends. Some people in my groups over the years, sure, certainly. But no, it's kind of funny. And, the conversation was sparked and inspired by, another conversation that we had off air. Essentially, in that discussion, we were talking about Rule 0, the rule of cool, and, do the rules matter? What about the rules of the game?
Yeah, and that's, kind of a touchy point, because you hear like all these different stories about, people who absolutely love the rule of cool and it supersedes everything. Or you've got people who talk about like, oh, you don't even need the rules. You just need imagination and dice and just play. And it's like, well, then...
Yeah, I don't use any of the rules. That's my secret and the players don't know. But at that point, are you even playing,
Right.
Are you even playing D&D?
Right. And that's something that kind of really fueled us to like, all right, let's have a conversation and say like, really what's in the books is D&D. And even if you modify and twist a little bit, you're still playing D&D. If you whole cloth say, oh, well, you're going to do this, but really we're not caring about any of those rules, you're not playing D&D, even if the players think they are, because what's on their character sheet doesn't really matter if you don't know about it and don't care about it.
Yeah, and you're not, everything they interact with, you're not using any of the game mechanic or stats. I've definitely changed things, moved things, and made things up on the fly, but the basis has always kind of been in, the core rules.
Right. You have to look at what is the core foundation. If you decide, oh, well, for no reason, this thing is going to have a proficiency bonus of +10, where there's nothing that shows that, like, unless you're talking about some ridiculously super powerful being that they shouldn't be fighting in the first place, like, why? Like, do you just need it to be better and it needs to win? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So if you're not familiar with, the rule of cool and Rule 0, Rule 0 basically says that the DM should be using common sense. So if things are, there that muck with fairness and ease of play, like you can kind of remove that or alter that in a way to allow everyone at the table to be having a better time.
Yeah, the DM's kind of the ultimate arbitrator of the rules. And also just there's things that the rules don't cover, so the GM has to make up how it's handled in the game anyway. So that's kind of like in a nutshell. Rule 0 is the GM makes up the rules, when needed or changes them.
And then, of course, the rule of cool is when somebody wants to do something that seems badass or awesome, it's going to be a cool thing, so I'll go ahead and allow it.
Yeah, and generally it is against the rules, right? Like, certain cantrips you can't use on anything but creatures. We know this because the rules tell us this.
Right.
But the DM might be like, oh, you know what? That's kind of cool. I'm going to allow it.
Now, we've seen some specific examples in our games where, somebody puts something in there that actually kind of goes against the rules or makes things a little bit more challenging, more difficult, just because they didn't fully understand the rule. And that kind of goes against, Rule 0 or the rule of cool that would actually allow things to be a little bit more streamlined. And
yeah, so sometimes too, just the simple fact as far as Rule 0 goes is like, is it going to bog down the game to look up the rules?
Mm-hmm.
And the GM will just make a call on the spot. You might later find out that is not actually the rules. You can either, keep going with that because it was more fun for your group, or you can go, switch back later and kind of adjust. But, a lot of times for us anyway, it's a lot more important to keep moving and having fun than it is for us to be all shuffling through books.
Right.
Our groups tend to not care that much.
Right. Now, in that specific example, that I was talking about of things, going against the rules, there are rules for having a jump distance based off of your strength score. It can tell you how far you can jump forward, how far you can jump up. No athletics check is necessary. You just have a set thing. And I know of 2 examples, where somebody was like, "Oh no, you have to make a check to see what happens." And in one case with your character, you end up dying because of it.
Yeah, so it is a weird thing, and in an article written by Doug over on the website, we'll put a link to it. You can go check it out. His thoughts on this whole thing, rule of cool, rule 0, and the actual rules of the game. He uses the example of jump, like, hey, my character wants to run across the room, hurdle the table, and attack the enemy. And in their mind, like, they're just adding a description and making it flavorful. They already know that their character has X amount of strength, therefore their jump check is X. There's nothing to roll. You just know what the numbers are. But in that instance, the GM's like, okay, make an athletics check. And there's a lot of GMs that are like that. Like, you're doing a thing, make a check. And, and the character fails the check and they end up falling prone onto the table instead of doing the cool thing, wasting their turn. And so in that case, like, rule 0 kind of trumped the actual rules, and I'm not so sure that made it better in that case. Like you mentioned, like I had a game where the GM was like, "Oh, you want to make this jump, then you have to make an athletics check," and it wasn't like a big jump. Cause like that's why I decided I would just do it because I'm like I figured my character can just do it. And they're like, "No, you failed the check. You fall in the lava. You're dead." And I'm like, well, "I guess I'm dead." Like because also I'm like, "All right, that's how this GM runs this game. That's fine." But these are examples of where okay, maybe that's not. Maybe that's not the best situation for a rule 0.
Yeah. So in those situations, the rule 0 of GM in charge actually caused problems. Your character dying, Doug's character losing a turn, which could have possibly led to other characters taking damage or getting hurt. But it definitely lessened the fun on those particular players. In those instances, and I'm sure there are loads of other stories out there where like. I'm all for new GMs taking up the mantle, but the player wound up having to bite their tongue, be like, that's not how it works.
So the way I kind of handle that stuff is one, I would let the player know up front, like this is how it would work, so they can decide. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go around the table then,
right,
because I don't want to deal with that, or I'm just going to. Can I just treat the table as difficult terrain? And expend more movement so I don't like lose my turn. But personally, a lot of times when players do creative things, I'm like, here's how I'm going to handle that. You can do it, but and I'm going to make you make an athletics check. If you fail this check, you're going to then make your first attack at disadvantage. But if you succeed this check, not only are you going to like hurdle over the table, you're going to leap off the table and you can do extra damage or something, or you can make your attack with advantage. So like if I'm going to make an extra roll, if it wasn't necessary because they wanted to do a cool thing, I'll usually I will up the difficulty, but also I want to give them a reward too.
And those are things that I feel kind of enforce, the rule of cool and rule 0 to make things better, because it's like, okay, well, I am making a little bit more challenging given the scenario, but there are rewards, and penalties that would go along with it. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. Whereas, like, if you just know, oh, I can do a thing, I've seen more GMs when a player says, I want to jump, assume that athletics goes along with it. Or some DMs are nice and say, well, you can use athletics or acrobatics. And in a recent game that I was in, there was a 10-foot distance to jump. My character is strong. I said, oh, I'm just going to, jump off the thing and go do this. And I was expecting to have to make an athletics check. And the DM just didn't say a thing, so I just went on with my turn, and I was so thrilled that didn't come up, because there could have been so many things that went poorly of like, oh, well, I land in the water, I'm wearing armor, now I got to worry about this, that, the other thing. So, it was all great, but it could have gone, worse. But, it happens.
Right. These are all examples of rule 0, the rule of cool, and the rules where they can all interact and where it can go either really right or really bad. But the rules are there to guide us and kind of show us the way.
Now, when we look at, there's a couple spells that, David was mentioning earlier, Acid Splash and Ray of Frost, both are cantrips, so you can cast them as much as you like, that specifically say you target a creature. And we've seen some examples where DMs have allowed players to be like, oh, well, can I Ray of Frost the ground to make slippery terrain? Or can I use Acid Splash to melt the lock? By Raw, these absolutely can't. And the reason for it is because if they were in the rules to say you can just do this all the time, those spells would become higher up on the list and become super spells, because not only are they attack, but they're also like utility things that you can do things with as well. And that kind of goes against the game balance of what cantrips are designed to do.
Yeah, I mean, another example would be Ray of Frost. I've seen characters be like, can I use that to put out fires or affect fires? And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, why not? Like, because sometimes the rules also seem arbitrary. It's like, why can you only Ray of Frost a creature and not an object? Now, maybe you wouldn't do something, or maybe it'll just do its damage, and its damage, depending on the object, may or may not matter. Can you Ray of Frost a puddle and make it freeze? Maybe not create slippery spots, but if there's water already there, you can maybe freeze it. Or, you can, it does a die 10 damage. Can you reduce a fire by a die 10 worth of fire, whatever that means in your game? So these are just like some things to think about in ways you could take the rules and change them. And I think where, arbitrating the rules of rule 0 or can be really helpful and make a game more exciting.
You have to figure out what for your game, for your table, is going to work best. Because I know that there are some people out there who are going to look at, oh, well, my GM allows for this, so I'm going to take these kind of options because I know that not only is this going to be utility, but also for offense, so this covers several different things. But I can't stop those players from having that kind of, thought pattern. And, if your GM is allowing it, I don't really see a problem with it.
So let's digress a little bit. So are we really telling people they need to read all the books?
No. The thing is, like, there is so much information that's there between, just the core books, let alone all of the books that are out there. You really have to know what is important for your character or your game.
Yeah, it depends on your role in the game. If you're a player or you're the GM has more responsibility to know more of the rules, just because they have to interact with more of the rules, right? And arbitrate more of them. So that becomes a lot more important. As a player, you have a whole lot less, but we'll get into like more specifics on that. So no, you don't actually have to read all the books. And there's other ways of learning too, right? Like you can watch YouTube and you can learn about it. You can watch streams and you can learn about it. You can have people teach you the rules as well. But the question too is like, are those really the best places to learn the rules from?
So, case in point, we've been playing D&D as well as other role-playing games, for 30 plus years. And, we've absolutely been called out of like, oh, you cited X, but that's not what it says in the books. So
we're probably not the only YouTubers that do that. And stream games as well can go in any direction. So while you can use these other resources to learn the rules, the best place to learn the rules is still from the books, because the people that made the game wrote those books. And, that is going to give you the best and most concise. And also, like, when you start doing Rule of Cool and, Rule 0, you have a better foundation when you have a better understanding of the rules.
Having that foundation allows you to be able to take it and move to the next step, whether you want to GM or you want to, oh, well, I've done what's necessary for my character. Well, now let me pick up another.
Interestingly enough, one of our friends who started doing like social media GM tips, Satine Phoenix, and they were doing DM tips. And like the very first one that she went with was like, read the books. And one of the things I saw on social media, she got called out for gatekeeping for saying, read the books. Now, I think there needs to be a little bit more nuance to that, as to far as like, obviously if there's reasons why people can't read the books, they have learning disabilities or other kind of impairments, it's not as accessible, then they might need to, learn from other sources or other ways. But, the best foundation you're going to get is from the rules that are in the books.
And I don't believe that, Satine was looking at it from a perspective of, well, you need to have the books, have your own copy, and, absorb, all of it. I believe, that Satine was looking at it from a foundation of, know the rules. If you have a better understanding of how the game works and what, all of the vast amount of information that is in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, we're finding or refinding all of, these great tools every so often. Every time I'm like, I don't remember this. Let me double check. Or, Doug pointing out, oh, well, there's this fantastic, tip on these 3 pages that, you might easily just bypass, flipping through. There's a lot of great nuggets of wisdom and useful stuff in that Dungeon Master's Guide. So if you're not familiar with what's there, you're missing out. And it's not, Satine trying to gatekeep or control what's there. It's more about, it's a fantastic book full of rich resources to allow you to be a better game master. So you should familiarize yourself with it.
Yeah, not everyone has a eidetic memory like Doug. But a lot of times people ask the question on social media, like, D&D needs this rule. And Doug will be like, it's on page so-and-so on this section, right? Like, so a lot of times those rules are in there. Now, it depends on your role in the game, too. If you're a player and a dungeon master, you need a different understanding of the rules. And it can be very intimidating. You're new to the game. You're just going to be a player. And, there's this 400-page book. But you don't really need to read 400 pages. A lot of that information you don't actually need. There's only a few sections as a player that you're going to actually need.
It really boils down to, very specific things. As a player, you need to know your race, you need to know your class, your background, your equipment, and, that chunk there isn't all that much, a handful of pages, a piece. It's 28 pages from chapters 7 through 9 of how to play the game. That's going to give you the core foundation of what's there. 28, 29 pages is not really all that intimidating. You can read that while you're, eating a meal. And then 12 pages for chapters 10 and 11 that talk about spells. And if you're not playing a spellcaster, you probably don't even need those.
Right. Now maybe you might want to read your specific spells that you pick, and then there's a little bit more. But you can chunk out this information to make it much more accessible and easier to absorb. Because frankly, if I were to just read a 400-page book, I'm not going to absorb all that information. Anyway, even as a GM, when I run new games, I look at them and I will look at the sections and go, okay, what sections do I really need as a GM? Monster of the Week is a good example of that. And I was like, well, the playbooks is all the stuff the players are going to do. I don't really need to know what's on their sheet, especially if I'm playing with more experienced players. So I just focused on the sections that were for the GM and how to run the game. The players, they didn't need any of that information. They just needed to know what was on their playbook and the very basics of how to run their characters.
Yeah, Monster of the Week, you really only need, 5 to 10 pages in order to be a player. Now, you might read more in depth to figure out what your options are, but once you've made your selection of what playbook you're going to do, boom, you just, figure out what your options are, put it together, and you've got a character sheet. Now, if you want to know more so that you're not surprised by your players, if you're going to run a game like Monster of the Week, you could read the section of what the GM needs to know. And then once your players have made their choices, examine their character sheets and their playbooks, ignore all the others, and you're good to go.
Yeah, and most games are like that, and D&D is even like that. It's just that it's a game built off of 3 core books, plus tons of other books, but you don't really need all that to get started and begin playing. And if your role is is a player, I shouldn't say just, but is a player and not the dungeon master, there's even less things you need to know, and you can kind of learn through play and figure it out as you go. But a core knowledge of the rules gives you a great foundation when you decide you're going to do Rule of Cool or Rule 0. It's going to be based in something. It's not going to be you just making things up. At that point, you might as well be playing anything.
And there are far simpler games out there that are far easier to adjudicate or Rule of Cool. So like if you're not really into playing,
If you don't want to use the rules, but you want to say you're playing, if you just want to say you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeon World's a great game with far less rules, and you just do things that you could be playing, and you could just call it Dungeons and Dragons, I guess.
I mean, you could call it whatever you like, but I mean, there's even simpler games than that. I mean, we've played Quest, and Quest is a very super simple game, very easy to pick up, very easy to learn, very easy to run. So
I guess what we're saying, if you want to play a game and not use the rules, there's games that are like that.
Indeed.
Right? If you're going to play a game, a good foundation in the rules is super helpful. But at the end of the day, whatever you decide to do in your game with your friends is completely up to you. Let us know what you think down in the comments below and share your ideas and thoughts with the Nerdarchy community.
while you're down there, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. You know the drill.
Quick reminder, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we drop new videos here on the channel, so come on back. Can't wait till then, no worries. We got a video up in the card up here you can check out where we actually talk about the rule of cool.
So until next time, stay nerdy.